Our presenter today is Mr. Aubrey Norton, a political scientist by education and training. He is the Executive Director of the Office of the Opposition. Mr. Norton is currently a part-time lecturer in international relations at University of Guyana. He has taught for 10 years, and he has lectured on foreign policy and later lectured in Caribbean politics, political systems and institutions, negotiations and conflict resolution, and government and politics of the third world. He's also widely known with foreign policy formulation and implementation. He served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with distinction, with timely foreign policy advice on the United Nations and UN-related institutions, the non-alignment movement, the Commonwealth, Europe, and the environment. Aubrey was a member of the Ghana delegation to the UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro. He was a member of the 44th session of the UN General Assembly. Aubrey holds a political science diploma from Julio Antonio Mella College in Cuba. He graduated with honors from University of Guyana with Bachelor of Social Sciences. He earned his Master of Arts in International Relations from the University of Canterbury in United Kingdom in 1994. Aubrey is a Guyana patriot. He's a member of the Guyana Parliament for 9 years and served as the General Secretary of the People's National Congress in 1997. Honorable comrades, Sherrod, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Aubrey Norton.
Good evening. Thanks for the introduction that has already placed me in a very difficult position because such glowing comments, it makes one's life difficult, but nevertheless, I will try to pull it together and see where we go. The first thing I want to say is that the world in recent times has been described, particularly in the Trump era, as a world in chaos, a world in disarray, among others. I do believe that amidst the chaos, there were clear foreign policy elements. But I would prefer to characterize it as a world in which conventions and the normal approach to diplomacy have been disrupted, rather than saying that the world is in chaos. Having noted the disruption to the usual diplomatic approach, I want to point out two things that characterize the era that will inform, I believe, where the United States is heading and its relations with other countries. The first one is, I think, one of the things the Trump era did was to allow the world to operate without the United States as leader. That has positives and negatives. It means that countries will now believe that they don't necessarily need a country as the leader. The second thing I want to point out about the era is this tendency to shift away from truth, when essentially foreign policy has to be based on truth. Every diplomatic handbook you pick up, it tells you that diplomats worry if they can't trust your word. Now, in the political realm, one should recognize that Trump's policy was characterized by isolationism. It was, in some regard, elitist in nature. it was interventionist, and it had a strong tendency towards unilateralism rather than multilateralism. In fact, its approach to climate change is a manifestation of that shift away from multilateralism to unilateralism. In some regard as well, whereas previously Europe was seen as a natural ally, in the context of foreign policy in the Trumpian era, Europe was seen as a competitor. And having seen Europe as a competitor, it generates problems, I would suggest, between the United States and Europe. I also want to make the point that at the political level, we see this tendency in the previous administration to want to go it alone and to ensure that allies pay their way rather than supplemented and supported by the United States. In the economic realm, we saw a complete shift to big business and control by the monopolies. In large measure, the approach was pro-monopoly, except when certain interests were threatened. We also recognize that there was a tendency, for whatever reason, to be very accommodating to the Russians while being viciously anti-Chinese. There are many explanations for the accommodation of the Russian, including alleged Trump business interests, and there was this anti-Chinese stance. Also, we saw the tendency in US foreign policy to court the states that had similar approaches to domestic issues and international issues. In this regard, Brazil under the present president, India under the present prime minister can be singled out as states that moved in this direction and was embraced by the Trump administration. We did not see as much focus on Latin America and the Caribbean in the last 4 years. Culturally, we saw the emergence, or I shouldn't say the emergence, I believe it always existed, but we saw an accentuation of supremacist approaches, be it in Brazil, in India, the United States, or Europe, where white supremacy lifted its head, and we saw it resulting in the emergence of an anti-migrant approach. And so culturally, I want to underscore that. But I also want to point out that this accentuation of the supremacy did not come in isolation. From the time Obama became president, on the one hand, you had those who were comfortable with the liberal type approach of Obama, and those who were elated by the first Black president in the United States. And it gave its inverse, or some Marxists would call it its dialectical opposite of white people feeling threatened and virtually emerge in some kind of a movement embracing Trump, and therefore again accentuating the ethnic problems in the United States. While that was occurring, I don't think I need to tell you, that also produced activism in the non-white sections of the society. Police brutality also contributed, and we know that Black Lives Matter emerged. And so when we talk about the United States in this particular era, one of the things I want to point out here is that there is going to be the tendency for the United States to look inward, at least in the first phase of the Biden administration, because the internal dynamics of the society, the emergence of supremacist sectors, the counter Black Lives Matter, COVID, which has had its severe impact on the society, and the need for the redistribution of wealth in the US and for the ordinary man to access social services have all commixed, in my opinion, to ensure that while there will be a focus on foreign policy in the early stages of the Biden administration, I believe the attempt will be to fix those things locally. That should be noted side by side, that in the political realm, there was a challenge to democracy or the democratic institutions. And that challenge also resulted in some amount of instability and resulted in a situation where the United States needs to fix the body politic at home. And so in the cultural realm, I wanted to underscore those. At the legal level, one saw a movement towards the disregard for the rule of law. And the challenge to democracy was always part of it. One saw as well a shift away from conventions. If you accept that for the first time in however long, a president, outgoing president, did not go to an inauguration of the incoming president, you see that the conventions are under stress. That was coupled with unorthodox diplomacy and approach to legal issues at the international level. It was compounded by what was obviously the toleration of corruption. And that went from the president to his people, going all the way down as far as we can know. And so one must not rule out the impact of that, what I call extra-legal culture that permeated the United States in the last 4 years. And in some regard, disregard for international law. I want you to note that though I have mentioned many of these aberrations, you must not run away with the impression that when it suited the United States under Trump, it resorted to these very principles that it was talking about. Bolivia, Guyana, we all know they return to talking about democracy, etc. Very hypocritical, but factual. And so we need to note it. So at the political, economic, socio-cultural, and legal levels, you would have seen the United States in some regard disintegrate. But disintegrate is too strong a word. I think destabilized for a while. Of course, for those who believe in the convention, it is some form of destabilization. For those who follow Trump, it was a challenge to orthodoxy and to the system. And therefore, for them, it's a legitimate approach. And you cannot dispense with the fact that close to half of the society embrace what we will call non-conventional, and what for them sought to pursue their interests, etc. Now, having said all of that, one must not conclude that the United States will abandon everything that Trump did.
Mr. Norton, please unmute your mic for us. Apologies there.
Sorry about that. I probably touched something. Okay, up to where I was saying.
Last sentence.
I was saying essentially that while on the one hand, it was anti-convention, on the other hand, it opened new vistas for supremacists, people who challenged the system. And so you saw fractures in the United States system, which will obviously have implications for the world, Europe, the rest of North America, Asia, Africa, Latin America. But having said that, I was going to make the point that one should not conclude that everything that Trump did will be thrown out. For instance, I believe the United States will still be anti-Chinese because the Chinese constitute a challenge to the hegemonic power. And so while there might be disagreements with the approach, the United States' interest lies in challenging China. The approach might be different. I gain the impression that the Biden approach will tend to be more to engage, to get advantages rather than disengage. Also, it is no doubt a concern of many in the United States that the United States tends to fetch Europe financially and otherwise, and that it is costing them too much. While Trump might have handled it in what I call an unconventional way, I believe this element of US foreign policy will be realigned, but pursued, because the United States would need help financially and otherwise to deal with the situation. And I have no doubt that listening to some of the Democrats, they believe Europe should pay more, though they don't believe it should be done in the way that Trump did it. I believe that the element that will be thrown out of what I call Trumpian foreign policy is that the Biden administration is likely to increase the approach. Sorry, let me put it differently. The Biden administration is likely to shift back to multilateralism and away from what I consider to be the unilateralism that was practiced in the main by the Trump administration. And so one has to recognize that there is no easy task facing the present US administration. And if one accepts that foreign policy is a logical extension of domestic policy, then one will recognize that the domestic situation will inform foreign policy position of the United States. In this regard, therefore, I believe we can recognize that one, the significant shift and focus to COVID. Now, this is important because the United States is lagging behind. I think they will seek to rectify the problems. And if you judge from the history of the United States dealing with pandemics, COVID can become an instrument of foreign policy, vaccine, approaches, you name it, as we have seen when they dealt with HIV/AIDS and the problems in Africa. So one must see the United States emerging and seeking to become a leader in terms of dealing with the pandemic and giving leadership to the world and being able to use this soft power that comes from such an approach. Then, as the United States deal with its domestic terrorism. And it's what I will call what is called the white supremacist activities. One will recognize that in some measure there are going to be some amount of clamping down, which will again create some problems in the nature of democracy or in the approach to democracy, because the United States will be faced with either instability or strong state action, which can appear to be anti-democratic, to deal with those issues. Also recognize that Biden was elected on significant non-white support, and therefore he will now be compelled by the architecture that now exists to, in large measure, increase the involvement of non-whites in the state apparatus. That can have the positive effect of changing the approach to what Trump calls shithole countries. Now, it must not be something that we don't take note of. Trump's approach to the third world was that they were inconsequential, really of no use. With the base on which Biden would have come to power, he will be expected to move in the direction of being pro-migration in a more structured way, promotion of minorities in government, etc. While that might be good for his base, it will also produce challenges in the sense of those who are anti-Black Lives Matter and anti-immigration will now have new ground to battle on. And so we should expect a structured approach to migration, which will have its positive and negative impact on countries like Guyana. Another critical thing at the domestic level is the Black Lives support, or the Black Lives Matter got considerable support from young whites. And young whites didn't just support them because they were Black. They were supported because there's a confluence of the poverty and disadvantage that young whites are facing in a society in which 1% is controlling most of the wealth, and the government of the society is facing a reduction in the standard of living. And so the positive that comes out of that is that Biden can also build a multicultural base, which involves young whites, in solidarity or in alliance with Black Lives Matter. But again, it will put it in contradiction to the mainstream Trump support. But clearly, the Biden presidency will have to respond to these domestic matters. I believe inherent in those, there is potential for countries like Guyana. But before I go there, I want to also point out that the US economic interests will not change. As it relates to oil, you are seeing some changes, and I want to deal specifically with it. The powerful businesses in oil seem to have challenged the status quo in the United States and seem to have been profiting at high rates in the United States economy. And so there's a desire in the US to rein them in. But that stands to me in contradiction to the fact that the United States also wants the wealth that comes from oil in other parts of the world. And so countries like Guyana can now use the US own position on them as some form of a bargaining chip, cognizant of the fact that in the final analysis, the United States will pursue its economic interests. Now, because the United States has to challenge China, and mind you, I want to point this out about China. China for years was linked to the third world. What that means is that it has a diplomatic infrastructure in the third world that it can access third world leadership and be of significant influence. The United States, I believe, will have to challenge that economic influence and provide more resources to the third world. That can open new vistas for countries like Guyana. But Guyana will have to learn how to be responsive to the concern of the US, responsive to the concern of the Chinese, and not be used in the process. Therefore, Guyana itself would need a diplomatic architecture to navigate, to both navigate and to exploit this weakness in the US-China relations. And so, as the US battles China, I believe third world countries, for the want of a better concept, can eke out, for the want of a better word, a living that is a little better than what they had before. So I believe that once Guyana analyzes this thoroughly, and mind you, I've only sought to select the key variables. If you look at the relationship with Africa, you will see the United States will be in conflict with the Chinese in Africa. But the Chinese themselves are not helping themselves by their cultural approach to the Africans, which is producing its own resentment, which could open new avenues to the United States. So even in Africa, there is no straight line. You are dealing with complex variables that you have to analyze and then work out your salvation. So for me, a small state like Guyana has to analyze the international situation, break it down into regions, look at the role of China, look at the role of India, look at the role of Russia, Japan, etc., and then formulate its foreign policy position to benefit from such a situation. Note as well, I pointed out that the United States is likely to shift towards multilateralism. A shift towards multilateralism will place us back in the role, in the position where the United Nations Charter matters, and that developing small countries like Guyana can now use the cover of multilateralism to pursue its objectives. I mean, I wouldn't go saying this public, but there was a contradiction in the Pompeo-Trump position. On the one hand, they were anti-multilateralism, but because the deals they made with Guyana, they pursued it, they went along to say they support the matter being resolved at the level of the International Court of Justice, which is multilateralism. And here is where I want you to recognize that when it suits the US, they will pursue their interests, and we will have to analyze and ensure we pursue our interests. But the return to multilateralism, I believe, open new vistas for Guyana to benefit. Also, the fact that the United States is likely to be less interventionist will matter, in the sense that the reduction in intervention will give us some scope to deal with Venezuela, which was closing, particularly as the PPP was following what I will call the Pompeo Doctrine. And so less interventionism is critical. But as the United States return to the path of being anti-corruption, that will have an impact on Guyana. And I believe one of the things that the AP and UAFC did that will serve us in good stead is to have the DEA here. And because you have the DEA here, the United States is no longer solely dependent on what the government says. They have the institutional capacity to monitor drugs and to take the actions necessary. In that regard, it will put strains on the People's Progressive Party approach. But at the same time, it will become our task here, meaning AP and UAFC, people who oppose the regime, to identify the historical links of the People's Progressive Party with illegalities and use it as the means to get in to the Biden administration. Now, support for Black Lives Matter will also create links. And then the struggle in the United States to give people more social benefits, because clearly Biden would have come to power on a promise to protect Obamacare. Obamacare is a social-oriented program that seeks to give health services to ordinary people, among others. What that will do is create the opportunity for countries like Guyana to have similar social programs without being accused of overstate involvement in economics. In some regard, we are seeing the end of that economic approach. The end is a wrong word. We are seeing a reduction in the approach which says the private sector solely pushes social infrastructure and social benefits, and a shift towards a dual approach in which the state will be involved and the private sector will be involved, which is what is sometimes described as by theorists as the developmental approach. The developmental approach, I believe, will augur well for Guyana. And so I want to now bring the ends together. We're in a world in flux. We should not believe that automatically the United States will be in the corner of the AP and UAFC. We have got to formulate our foreign policy positions, study what is happening in the world, and look for the chinks in the armor and get in. Economically, politically, socioculturally, and legally. We must not, for any reason, believe that there is some natural alliance between the AP and UAFC, Alliance of Change, and the Democratic Party. There is no such alliance. There is going to be a confluence of interests, and it will be dependent on us to identify those interests, pursue them, and to know when our interests will conflict with the powers that be, including the United States, and develop skillful ways of ensuring that it doesn't escalate and rupture the relationship, while at the same time exposing the PPP for what they are in terms of illegalities, drug trafficking in people, and create a hiatus between them and the administration, while opening avenues for us to benefit from the extant or the emerging diplomatic international architecture. I hope I have not gone too far, but in my opinion, this is the kind of world we are in, with various forces at play, and it is how we work out our salvation. Read the tea leaves and then act appropriately. In a nutshell, that is what I wanted to say.